So, migrant workers, essentially when we say that, we're speaking about people in 3 different programs. The temporary foreign worker program, which includes restaurant workers, construction workers, just a whole slew of programs that are either considered low-waged or high-waged. And Senthil is going to speak to us about that today. Then it is the caregivers program, or the live-in caregiver program, which Jonah is going to speak to us about, which is about caregivers coming largely from the Philippines and the Caribbean, sometimes living in employers' homes for up to 24 months and being able to apply for permanent residency. And finally, the seasonal agricultural workers program, which is a program under which farm workers, largely from Mexico, the Caribbean countries, come to Canada for 8 months at a time on tribe permits. And farm workers come to the country for 8 months at a time, live here, work here, but are not able to apply for citizenship. And unfortunately, we don't have anyone. We've been on a tour with a farm worker who's not been able to join us today, and I'll speak about that and why that is in a few minutes. So, when we talk about the migrant worker program, one of the key stories that everyone's been hearing, which was part of the reason we started this tour, are these stories of migrant workers stealing jobs from Canadian citizens. How many of you have heard of the RBC story? You know RBC? Okay, so most of the room is raising their hand. And the story we hear about the RBC is that a group of Indian workers came, RBC hired them and laid off some white Canadian citizen managers, right? That's the story you've heard. What we haven't been told enough is that in fact this was the 4th such computing department that RBC was offshoring to India. And for the last 3 departments that they were moving over to India, they had flown these white managers, these white Canadian male citizen managers to go train the Indian workforce, and that was costing them more than they wanted it to. So this 4th time, they decided that they would fly in some Indian managers, have them work in the country for about 2.5 months, where they would be trained, and so when the entire department would be offshored to India, those managers could go and train the Indian workforce. Now that's a very different story. That changes who is to be blamed, that changes who is responsible, that changes the entire dynamics of the story. However, there's one story that stuck and one that didn't. And we want to speak today about why it is that there's a very specific story of migrant workers that's being repeated over and over. And we want to hopefully provide some counter-narratives, some counter-arguments that you can use at your home, at your workplace, with your colleagues, your family. But also we want to really focus on what it is that we can do together to turn this tide. Another thing we hear about this question of unemployment is that migrant workers are causing unemployment, right? That's very much constant. What we don't hear is that there are about 100,000, less than 100,000 low-wage migrant workers in Canada. And there are 1.3 million unemployed Canadian citizens, right? So even if we decided to accept this racist diatribe and somehow manage to deport 100,000 people, there would still be 1.2 million unemployed Canadian citizens. So the question of who is causing unemployment and what a solution to unemployment might be needs to start from a very different place. Yet over and over again, we hear migrant workers being blamed. Now, also in this conversation around unemployment, what we don't really talk about is that we're living in a socio-economic system, neoliberal capitalism, that requires that at least 6% of the population is unemployed. That's called ideal rate of unemployment, right? A large group of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are considered, need to be impoverished, need to be economically unable to meet their basic life needs for this economic system to work, right? And so when we talk about unemployment, why is it that so much of the focus has been on temporary foreign workers? Now, another thing that we hear constantly about the temporary foreign worker program is that it is a Canadian problem, right? So there are different ways this is being talked about. So we hear that the Harper government has decided to create this program that's supposed to be a program for short-term labor gaps. So you need to bring in migrant workers to fill in short-term labor gaps. And even progressives will believe that the problem is that corporations and businesses are inappropriately using the program to bring in workers when there isn't a labor gap, right? That's the sort of story we've heard. Now, what is lost within that are two things. One is that the temporary foreign worker program in its current inception has been around, at least for the caregivers, since 1901. From farm workers since 1967, and for the temporary foreign worker program since 1973. So for 50, 60, and over 100 years, the temporary foreign worker program has existed. It has existed irrespective of what is happening in the economy, whether there is the highs of the economic boom or the lows of the recession. These programs are here. So they're not about fulfilling some sort of a short-term labor need. And so it is not that corporations are inappropriately breaking the laws to bring in migrant workers, okay? So I'm just trying to paint a picture here. Now, another portion of this is that we hear this all the time, that since 2008, more migrant workers have entered the country than Canadian citizens. Have many of you heard of that? This year is completely trumpeted over and over since 2008 because it places the blame on one government, right? Now, the caregiver program in 2008 brought in over 12,000 people. In 2013, it brought just a little over 4,000 people. So in fact, particular aspects of the temporary foreign worker program are being shut down. It isn't as if there's this huge boom in migrant workers coming into this country. Okay? So what does all of this mean? And what does it mean in the context of the fact that the entire immigration system is actually moving towards temporariness? So there isn't just that temporary foreign workers are exceeding, but rather temporary streams have been built in what used to be permanent immigration. So now parents and grandparents come into Canada, so-called, family sponsorship, and they come in on a super visa, which is a temporary system. Spouses, so your partners, now come into the country through something called conditional permanent residency, which is a temporary spousal sponsorship system. The government has a lot more tools at its disposal to take away immigration status and Canadian citizenship and permanent residence. So in fact, even those seemingly permanent resident systems are becoming temporary. So the entire system is moving towards temporariness. Okay? So what am I trying to do? I'm talking about basically 6 conceptual frameworks. Migrant workers are not a new issue. The issue is not the presence of migrant workers are not causing unemployment, and temporariness is happening across the system. Now let's talk about the global situation. When I was talking about how this is not just purely a Canadian problem, 140 countries around the world, 140 countries have signed agreements to move towards temporary residence programs. Okay? So the entire world is agreeing to moving towards temporary immigration. Again, not just a Canadian problem. Okay? And then finally, we hear about, because temporary workers are in the country, the overall wages and working conditions of everyone is collapsing, right? So migrant employers can simply bring in foreign workers and pay them less, right? We hear this story. But actually, what isn't clear there is that there's 2 systems of law. So the federal government that brings in people as temporary residents, and then the provincial system that allows the paying of lower wages to those people, or creates an entire legal system that says that people should not be able to assert their rights. So it's not so much just simply the presence of migrant workers in the country that's causing worsening conditions, but rather it is provincial laws that are excluding migrant workers from rights and protections. Okay? So it's a global problem. It's not new. It's not just Canadian. It's not about capitalism. I'm sorry, it is about capitalism. It's not about unemployment, right? It's not about, it's not about all of these things that we've just heard it's about. So what is it about, right? It's about racism. It's about pushing people into particular places, taking people from the racialized world, the South, to come here to work on short-term permits without rights. And it's not going to be resolved in any easy way, right? And so since June of this year, we've seen a series of immense changes that have taken place in the temporary foreign worker program. And just less than 2 weeks ago, on October 31st, we saw a massive change in the caregiver program that Jonah is going to speak to us about, right? So this program is fast changing. And we want to respond to those changes. And basically what those changes are doing, there's a lot of nitty-gritty, but the basic thing is it is making it harder for people to change jobs. And it is making it harder for people to stay here permanently. So in response to that, in response to this, what is a very complex immigration and labor issue, what are we proposing? What we're proposing is a way of accompaniment. And that is to create spaces for migrant workers to really be able to gather together, speak, and come up with political solutions that are true for those communities. And so what we've been doing over the last week is taking this idea and connecting with people across this province, inviting people to create spaces for migrant workers to gather and make their own political decisions. So not so much about migrant workers coming together, sharing stories of abuse and then being translated by advocates or experts or allies, but rather simply creating space for migrant workers to be at the forefront of change. And that has been extremely successful. We've seen here in the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change that migrant workers have gathered together and changed laws around recruiters. We've seen that caregivers have made it, have changed the laws around the live-in requirements. So there is a massive shift that is taking place that is being led by migrant workers. We've had people ask Senthil, Jonah, and Lloyd about how they've taken risk, how it is that they've taken all of this courage to be here, and I think that these stories are really critical. But in every one of the cities, we're actually here to throw the question back to all of you to say, what risks are you going to take? Right? To service providers, we ask, we know that there is no government funding to serve migrant workers. Are you going to take the risk to serve people? We know that many labor unions are not able to organize farm workers because the law bans it. We're inviting people to take that risk. We know that migrant workers can't speak out or get arrested or put their bodies on the line. And we're inviting all of you to take that risk, right? So the question, we know migrant workers are taking a risk. They're, in our offices, they're in our meetings, they're leading marches, they're, on November 22nd, there's gonna be a march. So we know that. The real question is, why aren't the rest of us? And so I really want that, if there's some takeaway from here, that hopefully is one that you can share also. Okay, more questions, thoughts, comments, strategies?